So what I want to do here is kind of isolate three, if you like, states of the phenomenology, as you would have seen from some of my other videos, that actually, for a lot of us, the phenomenology varies through time. But what I want to do is just pick three kind of states that relate more or less to the experiences of psychic, psychotic, and prophet, and just to give you, some kind of understanding, well, to give you different perspective on it. So the language that I'm using here is to kind of, I talk about how it engages the mind, so how it sort of kickstarts the processor. And I talk about three things. I talk about the mode, by which I primarily mean kind of one-way, two-way. It's the sort of observing and knowing thing that I mentioned in the hub slide in the beginning. The style, which I'm used to represent largely the body language, so the kind of overall behavior, of the phenomenology. And then, of course, the timing, because I say this thing acts very deliberately in your life to anticipate what it is that you're doing, because if it can do that, it can mess with your expectations. And of course, if our expectations are out of kilter, our reaction to it is much, much stronger. And of course, that then shapes everything that flows that. So by changing mode, style, and timing, voices can sort of engage us in a way that asserts relevance, which we then, of course, flow through in our processes to assess implications. So the three states that I'm going to talk about are this one. So imagine hearing just a sound out of context, don't know what it is, seeing something a little unusual, and of course, not actually being able to connect it to your environment. So you see it, you think, well, where did that come from? When you look again, and then you can't actually verify it, so you're kind of seeing this in some sort of way, or perhaps hearing, the sound of somebody's voice, or somebody calling your name, perhaps is by far the most common one. And of course, there not being anybody around particularly. But really what these things are doing is they are getting your attention in some way. And I just call them, for want of another description, they're kind of mixed snippets. And by mixed, I mean sort of multisensory. It might, as I say, be sound, a vision, language, a voice, or it might be temperature, feeling hot or cold, the air standing up on the back of your neck in a particular room in the house or somewhere, something along those lines. So of course, these are just little, what I would call extra sensory snippets. The second, category I want to talk about now is sort of imagine, voices, or two people talking sort of, but much closer. So just, near enough to be relevant, if you like, at the moment. And of course, what we do with that is we attach personalities to it. So in the way that I described in my first episode videos, I heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing while I was home alone. I interpreted that as the neighbors. So that's what I mean, hearing the sound of two people talking, so sort of near enough. And of course, I start to attach personalities to them. So this is what we would call auditory verbal. So it's sound, but it's verbal. So it's introducing language. Of course, language is how we understand things. So, so that's just upping its relevance quotient, if you like. And then the third is, let's say, what is typically called, by researchers, the thought echo. And this is where, as I mentioned in my first episode videos, that the experience of the phenomenology is kind of almost like it sort of invades the mind, for want of another description, and makes your thoughts loud and audible. And suddenly you find that actually you're hearing your thoughts broadcast in the same bandwidth as the voices that you're hearing. Now, the implications of that are that my thoughts are actually shared in this bandwidth, so broadcast in some way. But of course, the effect of that is that my thoughts now have consequences. So what's happening from that sort of relevance point of view, if you like, along this scale from left to right, is that over here, these are snippets of data, for want of another description, that only become information if I plug them into a context, if you like. So I'm assimilating those as data and asking myself the question, does this mean anything? Does it have relevance? and then based on what's going on around me, I may actually accept it or dismiss it. So in kind of quite much the same way that we would assimilate data or information from our environment, as we sort of do from our senses. The only difference here, of course, is that actually I can't specifically connect it to my environment, but I'm experiencing it in, say, in an ordinary sort of sensory way. I just have no context for it. So, of course, I then kind of shift to saying, does this have any meaning or value? So I assimilate it as data in a relatively ordinary way. This one, because I say it's now sort of closer, if you like, and it's language, it's more likely to have relevance, and I say typically it presents as relevant information. And this is the big kind of step to say that it's taking, is that the information presented now seems more relevant. And as I mentioned in the first episode videos, I heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing while I was home alone, which meant that somebody could see what I was doing. So it presented as relevant information because I was home alone. People shouldn't have been able to see into my apartment. It had to be, of course, say from the fire escape and therefore the neighbors. But that's what I mean. So by presenting as relevant, I've interpreted it and I've plugged personalities into the other end of it. Whereas this one over here is, has changed the game completely, because my thoughts now have consequences. So what you recognize here is this interaction between some entity, unknown, although I say it later on started to assert what it was or who it was, but it's now engaging with my thoughts and what voices say, as the two sides of a coin of a conversation, and a conversation that actually has consequences. So this is the very, very big difference in terms of the experience just of the phenomenology, is of course that, from left to right, this is much, much more invasive. Over here, I might feel that I have some sort of sense of control because I'm experiencing it kind of more as a sensory thing. Whilst I may or may not be able to sort of call it up or something, I can certainly dismiss it, easily or not. I can actually decide what to do with it. That's the thing, what I mean by assimilating it here as data. Here, of course, so when I first heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing, the logical thing to do was to interpret it in some way, and I reached the conclusion that it had to be my neighbors. It was only after I'd been to the doctor who described, that I was, experiencing auditory hallucinations, that the idea of dismissing it even occurred to me. And of course, by then voices were, in this mode actually with me already, and of course I couldn't ignore them because every thought I had consequences. So even thinking I'm going to dismiss it, is just, it becomes a meaningless kind of idea because this thing is engaging with your thinking. So that's what I mean by your thoughts actually now have, your thoughts have consequences, and of course you can't ignore it, you can't dismiss it. The best you can do is reject it. And of course, and you don't realize that you don't realize that at first. So relevance is one thing, invasiveness is another kind of idea. And of course, as I mentioned, it comes with a style. So, not sort of what voices say. So my voices, for example, they can say, I love you in a way that kind of sounds okay. And they can say, I love you in a way that means completely the opposite. And of course, that is simply by changing the tone of voice. So this whole thing, of course, is that it has what I call body language. So in the same way that ordinary communication, has this very large non-verbal component that's true, of this interaction with this phenomenology. And of course, I say this really, really sort of confuses the issue. Until you recognize that it's just body language, and it gives you a way to compartmentalize it and deal with it differently. And of course, what's happening is that over here, these bits of information are just suggestive, if you like. So they're bits of information that come into your aware mind in some way. And of course, so it's information. The reason I call it suggestive is it's prompted in or presented in a slightly unusual way. but of course, I say, isn't aggressive in the way that it's inserted, if you like, into your aware mind. Whereas over here, as I say, every piece of information from these voices is very much, inserted into the mind in a very assertive way. And of course, over here, voices may actually, of course, be claiming, who they are and who you are, as I'll show you. And then, of course, the other layer that I want to add to this is remembering, of course, that our mind is predictive, that we experience things in a sense of time. So the timing of when this happens, of course, is very, very important, because that's what affects what we expect, and of course, what we expect affects our reaction to it. And so this timing has these many components. It's presence. So once I've been exposed to it, I'm aware of its presence. I know it's there. And of course, I only have to experience it 2 or 3 times to start asking the question, well, when is it going to happen again? And so, of course, there's this kind of concept of absence, which is a form of presence, because I'm anticipating when it will actually come back again, because it's that unusual. And of course, then there's the question of, well, how often does it happen? Which is this kind of frequency, which starts to tie into the idea of when and where. And then, of course, there are other kind of timing type things that relate, as I say, for example, to body language. So one of the things I mentioned that's particularly significant here is voices are able to change their tempo, and even sort of tone of voice, basically to change the urgency of the piece of information that is being presented. And of course, that experience of urgency changes the significance of it. And of course, what all this is doing is leading us to sort of start asking the question, when and where is this going to happen? So we've built this evidentiary pattern, based on when we do experience it. Of course, we start to predict that or project it forwards. And then, of course, we start to anticipate it. So, of course, this is the anticipation, because we don't know what to expect. We kind of start to try and anticipate it. And of course, if it's doing its own thing, of course, we struggle to anticipate it. And of course, our expectations can often become fearful. And of course, that's what leads to paranoia, and of course, then panic when it arrives at an unexpected time. So the words that I'm using, for these 3 are, I'm calling this one over here, that the mode is one way. So this is a piece of information that I'm receiving, if you like. The implications, though, of it are outbound. I'm kind of comfortable that actually it's only relevant, when I make it relevant, and I make it relevant, of course, typically if it's as a psychic, it's for someone else. This one in the middle, is sort of your mode one way. So I'm hearing now, sort of language. And of course, as soon as it starts talking about me, then the implications are inbound. So that it then, of course, matters to me. And over here, the mode is now two-way, where it's what I'm calling sort of forced telepathic. So the implications are now going in both directions. So the implications are obviously, for me, it's inbound in that sense. But of course, now voices are claiming that my thoughts have consequences, not just for me, but for others. So of course, it's this kind of telepathic thing that sort of creates this concept where actually my thoughts now have consequences. So this is much more suggestive. This is actually much more assertive. So what this bottom row here is about is how the phenomenology actually gets attention. So my predictive sense of how it's getting attention, if you like. This sort of next line is about how it asserts relevance and significance in my life. So over here, it's becoming relevant. Over here, the fact that my thoughts are shared and have consequences has suddenly become hugely significant in my life, because obviously I can't stop thinking. And of course, voices, not only that, voices are provoking my thinking. So if every thought has consequences, of course, that can, of course, be very, very scary. And this is what makes thinking scary sometimes, when you hear voices. And of course, this is when people talk about racing thoughts. This is voices provoking you. Our mind is sort of fast forwarding implications And of course, that's the experience, if you like, of racing thoughts. This middle row, the sort of the pictures, is the way that the phenomenology or the phenomenon presents information in the aware mind. So this is how it brings the information into focus. So this is a little unusual, comes into my focus. I can choose whether or not to assimilate it, in some way and integrate it into my thinking. Over here, it's presented as language. If it's talking about me, it's much, much more relevance. Of course, that comes into my focus. And over here, it's actually kind of turned the tables, and my thoughts are now in focus, whether I like it or not. And every thought I have has consequences. So these sound, I say, these seem like relatively small shifts in phenomenology. You'll gather from that actually the significance for me and my interpretation or a prediction of that in terms of consequences in my life, the implications, of course, change quite dramatically on those little turns in phenomenology. So this line then, this kind of invasiveness and the body language that sort of go together, they are the sort of, they are sort of things that signal intent. So as this thing becomes more invasive, more aggressive, as it changes tone, if you like, the body language, of course, it can kind of signal intent before it even says anything. And of course, that's how it creates a scene or a scenario, in which the information that is thrown at you, is received in a hyper-vigilant, hyper-aware state of mind that then maximizes the strength of the signal when it comes into focus. And then, of course, this sort of top line, the timing, is a way of creating uncertainty, which is the same idea, of exaggerating hypervigilance and hyper-awareness. And of course, this whole thing then gives you an idea of how voices have a large number of variables that they can actually change, to which which can create different kinds of experiences. And of course, a lot of the experiences rely on our cognitive bias, if you like. So the comments I've made about how this is changing your awareness or your hypervigilance, if your attitude towards it, of course, is positive, and you then receive a signal in that sort of frame of mind, it's going to confirm your belief in the idea that you're a psychic. Whereas over here, if as in my case, voices asserted to be God and the devil and an evil God and declared that I am the second coming, that was them, exaggerating their power, making me a pawn in their game, and of course that experience of it can be particularly unexciting and particularly frightening. So what I want to do here is actually, just put that in motion a little and kind of just show you, so that was the static picture, if you like. So now I'm going to just do a similar kind of thing. I'm just going to do it sort of progressively and show you some sort of shades of gray in between those, those sort of those three states, and then kind of show you how actually the phenomenology leads you towards experiences of being, as I say, a psychic, where I view myself as having powers, if you like, or a power to access this other world that other people don't have, to being psychotic or mad, as you might call it, and towards being a prophet, where now you're actually chosen by a power on high. And I use that language rather than a higher power. So of course, this is is the psychotic experience, where I'm asking all these what to believe questions, whereas over here as a psychic, I'm providing some mystical or mysterious answers for someone who sort of comes to me. If voices are sort of talking very much about me and my life and getting in the way of it, I'm going to be asking what to believe questions. And then, of course, if voices come along and say, you're the perfect man for the job, you are the second coming, and will you rewrite the Bible? Of course, then voices have actually chosen you, to be the second coming, whether you like it or not, is my experience of it. And of course, what they've done is they've shouldered you with these extra responsibilities, which is their way of exaggerating the consequences of your thinking. And of course, that's the experience of being a prophet, which is not much fun when you're being a prophet to an evil god who wants to just impose his ideas on you and the rest of the world and make you responsible for it. And you know, that's you know, just by assertion rather than based on any evidence, of course. So so before doing the kind of gradual movement through those kinds of styles, I want to just kind of remind you here that actually the mind is predictive. So recognize that when voices are making a comment, what the mind is doing is, you know, sort of processing that quickly to assess the implications. So what you're going to recognize, of course, is that the mind is predictive. So it's doing that processing. It's going from now to what this means. And of course, I'm asking the question, well, where is this information coming from? Is it the neighbors? Is it God? Is it the devil? Is it an evil God? Is it grandma? Is it aliens? I say, you know, so is it multiples? You know, we have all these ideas about what's at the other end of this jack-in-the-box winding the handle. And of course, what my brain is doing is I'm processing that information and projecting it out there, and kind of I'm in the middle of it. And of course, if voices can exaggerate the consequences of me being in the middle of it by making my thoughts consequential, then of course the experience is, you know, is much, much more severe. So of course, this is then, I say, based on the idea that there is this hub that connects. The voices, of course, I'm experiencing this thing. I don't know what it is, but voices are claiming that it does connect me to other humans, and of course, and to them, and they can redistribute the information, my thoughts, for example, in any way, of course, that I like. But by, you know, introducing this kind of otherworldly thing, they're claiming this other space, and of course, they then start to say, well, they set the rules, and of course, you know, because they then have asserted this space as being dominant over the real world, they kind of start to assert the rules in my world and tell me what I can and can't do, or what I can and can't think. And of course, you know, they confuse the issue by sometimes saying, I love you, while behaving rather badly in general. So although I hear voices in the background, you know, kind of saying, I love you in time, you know, you just don't know what's, you know, what's what really. So I simply say, if you so. And of course, you know, these kinds of ideas about how, you know, how good or bad it is in your head is about your thinking, is a sort of knowing comment, you know, on me and my thoughts. So the sort of observing my thoughts becomes, you know, a much more knowing kind of idea. And of course, you know, by then kind of, you know, because voices are observing every thought and commenting on every thought, they sort of then make these claims about what I do and don't understand. And of course, because they're imposing this otherworldly thing, you know, where they're trying to sort of set the rules, they can just claim that I do or don't understand in this other space. And of course, the only evidence that I have to work with is the behavior of voices, or the, you know, the phenomenology. And then of course, they start to influence my prediction of implications by starting to sort of make predictions and kind of start to say, well, this man is going to, which of course this man could be me or someone else. And of course, you know, while they're waiting, you know, because, you know, your experience of this soon becomes that actually they can't do any of this stuff about who is doing what, where, and when. What they have to do is actually wait for stuff to happen in your life, and then confuse your reading of that, your perception of it. So while they're hanging around, they kind of start to pester you and kind of say, well, please don't do this, or please do that. And, you know, sit down and turn on the TV as if I, you know, should give a darn about them. And, you know, and of course, the whole idea that I'm actually their entertainment, you know, I often say to them, I think I am their TV. And of course, they use that whole idea of observing to claim just that. So just bear in mind as I go through this thing, you know, of kind of showing little nuances of how the phenomenology shifts, that what's happening is sort of each comment is a fully formed idea. It presents a context, even if it doesn't have one. So, you know, it says, you know, agree, well, you can't do that. That actually, I react to that and saying, well, who are you to say so? Of course I can do that. So it creates a context in terms of, you know, where the context is just me and what I can and can't do. That engages my brain and my story. So it engages it gets my attention emotionally. And of course, by predicting, it's, you know, getting involved in my story, and that's my predictive reaction response. And of course, that's happening fast. And of course, the implications of that are uncertain. And of course, voices easily make that extreme by claiming to be, the devil, say, or a demon, or anything else, that has influence, in your life. They can actually make those implications more extreme in the mind. And then simply by persisting and provoking and throwing these comments at you, they create these endless permutations, as I mentioned, on an earlier slide. And of course, because this is happening quite fast and your mind is in fast mode, assessing these implications, the little nuances of as this thing shifts are kind of lost in the sort of in complexity and confusion. So same three modes. I'm just going to do them in a slightly different view, if you like. So imagine just hearing a sound out of context, or perhaps that sort of strange feeling, hair standing up on the back of your neck, seeing something unusual, or hearing perhaps, as I say, the sound of somebody in just a kind of snippet, if you like. Engages our senses in particular ways. So sight is much more kind of likely to engage our view of the future. Language is much more inclined to lead us towards giving it meaning. And of course, depending on what the language is, what the words are, it can be made much, much more specific. So if, for example, I see a picture that looks like Mary, then I've had a vision of the Mother Mary. Of course, so I give that meaning in a particular way. And of course, because our mind is predictive, we're much, much more likely to give this meaning in the future. Of course, we're going to connect it to history. So a vision of the Mother Mary, for example, obviously would have a connection, particularly if you're a Catholic. In your history. If you're not a Catholic, you wouldn't even recognize it, as Mary, for example. So our history, of course, has a context, but we translate it in terms of our future. So of course, what's happening here is to say, when I'm experiencing just these sort of snippets, particularly if I'm experiencing, these two over here, I am led towards, interpreting it in the future with meaning in some way. And of course, in my answer to the question, what is it? I'm answering it by kind of saying, I see something that you don't. Therefore, I know something, if you like, that you don't. And of course, I start to answer the question, well, how is this happening, with the answer that, well, I'm gifted, I'm clairvoyant, I'm clairaudient. Which I say clairvoyant, clairaudient are literally just descriptions. I see things and hear things that you don't. And of course, when I ask the question, well, why and why me? I start to say, well, I'm psychic, and I have this extra sense, and then as a psychic, the why me? I have a role or I can play a role in society, if you like. That's a little different. And then, of course, the where, when of this becomes something that I now actually start to seek it out. And then I might perform some kind of ritual to create a state of mind in which I am more receptive or more able to receive these little snippets of information. And of course, I may go into a trance. I may organize a seance where I'm lighting candles and setting up the room in a particular way, or I may dance with music, drumming, rhythm, something along these lines. So we have lots of interpretations of rituals in which, the psychic or the shaman creates the conditions under which they are more amenable to communicating with this other world. So we do lots of things to let this phenomenon know that we're ready to receive, if you like. And of course, it may or may not happen, depending, of course, sort of on the circumstances. And then, of course, we rationalize this. But of course, what's happening over here is that we've created a relationship with the phenomenon that, if we have interpreted it as I am psychic, our emotional response to it is a good one. So it's ticking other boxes on our soothe system. We're not seeing it as threatening. We're kind of saying, okay, I'm psychic, I'm special, I'm gifted. And of course, from a drive point of view, we're saying it's actionable under certain circumstances, and I can help others with it. And of course, the reason I say help is, for me, this is an entirely unethical thing, because it has no provenance. There is no code of ethics for being a psychic. It's nothing, it's not something we can manage the quality of. So I'm sorry, I take an extreme, well, I wouldn't say an extreme view. I take a pretty, for me, rational view that actually this thing has no provenance, and we should be cautious of it. But of course, what's happening here is it's easily translated to the idea that I'm gifted. And of course, what happens then is I generalize that belief. I have extra senses. I receive messages from, and of course, what I then start to do is say, my dreams have meaning. And of course, I start to interpret these little signs and signals and things in some way, because my emotional experience of it is comfortable. That's okay. What happens then, in the kind of the next phase is this thing now. So it comes a little bit closer. Let's say I hear the sound of voices talking about someone, let's say, in the distance. So here it's still kind of okay. I might still interpret it in this sort of same vein. And if someone came to see me as a psychic, or if, say, my tribe came and asked a question of me as a shaman, I would interpret this in that sort of context and recognize, of course, that this is just an interpretation of a snippet of information in the context of the question that somebody has presented to me. Zero provenance, and of course, we've given it relevance just by organizing it in that way. So let's say now that actually this voice comes a little closer to home, something that sounds a little familiar, and I might kind of say, okay, this is perhaps my grandmother. This is a photograph of one of my lovely grandmothers. And of course, there are many cultures that believe we're in touch with our ancestors. And of course, that would mean grandma, grandpa, in particular, certainly, from younger age, parents later on, or any, family that passed on, really. And of course, this is still, if this voice behaves in a way that is consistent with grandma, then of course that is still a comfortable belief. And then I want to show you now how one little nuance changes that. Sorry, I'm one step ahead of myself here. What happened over here is that from a relationship with the phenomenon, I now have a relationship with a persona. I might be, declaring it known on the basis of some similarity to grandma, but in reality, it's an unknown. So at least sort of ask yourself the question: why don't we all hear grandma? Why would it be a cultural thing? That makes no sense at all. We're all human. There's no reason, why one culture should be more predisposed, to hearing grandma than any other culture. It's entirely illogical, so it has no provenance at all. This is just us giving it meaning and expression. So I say this is a relationship with a persona unknown that we're attaching a personality to make it known at best. And then, of course, as this thing comes a little closer still and starts to talk about me as a person, or about what I'm doing, about me as a person. So in my first episode video, I first heard voices talking about what I was doing, and a day or two later they started talking about me as a person, stuff they wouldn't have known unless they'd been observing me for much longer than I was through hearing voices. And then, of course, as they started to follow me outside the apartment, and we're then talking about what I was doing and what I might do and where I was going, all they were doing was moving back and forth in time in my life, and of course changing, shifting this idea of observing to knowing, simply by moving up and down the time scale of my life. So the first nuance was, suddenly voices are talking about me. I'm trying to attach a personality to the other end of it. Originally, at first, it was the neighbors. When voices started following me outside the apartment, it could no longer be the neighbors. But by now, the behavior was aggressive and bullying and following me, spying on me. The answer I was likely to reach was certainly not going to be grandma, and certainly not going to be a friendly one. So of course, I'm saying I don't know what this is, but the answer I'm plugging in is definitely not a good one. And those nuances happen very, very suddenly. Voices suddenly talking about me. talking about what I was doing, talking about what I had done in the past, talking about what I was doing and about to do, moving up and down the time frame. And suddenly this thing is interfering in my life, and my privacy has been violated. My emotional response to it is unpleasant, and the beliefs I'm liable to reach about it are unpleasant. So the answers I'm plugging in to this question are not friendly at all. And of course, I'm observed by something, I don't know what it is, and my mind is processing that quickly to kind of say, well, this is what it means. And of course, voices are talking about me, and of course, I now start to think about myself, what I'm doing, about who I am. And of course, I've now formed this new relationship with myself just by thinking about myself. And of course, voices come along now and engage your thoughts and sort of bring your thoughts into focus, very much so, by creating this sort of thought echo. And of course, by exaggerating that, by asserting that my thoughts have consequences, not just for me, but for others. And I now have this much, much more aggressive and invasive interaction, of course, with this phenomenon, which then, of course, distorts my relationships with everything. Of course, not just with, not just with myself, but of course now, because everything I think about has consequences, I say this thing is now distorting my relationships with and to absolutely everything in my life, certainly everything I think about. And of course, this is why I say it's distorting my relationships thoughtfully, because voices are now provoking my thinking in particular directions simply by throwing a comment at me. They're bringing up a context. So the moment they can either start talking about people in my life, for example, my relationships, or the moment I start to think about people in my life, literally, for example, I start to think about who might I get help from when voices are being aggressive. Of course, that mere thought, the thinking about who I might actually get help from, is now actually shared with this phenomenon. So I no longer have a strategy. I no longer have the ability to plan, to think about anything without voices actually knowing my every thought. And of course, this is a much, much more distressing experience. And of course, as I think about people in my life, about my world, about what I'm doing, about my future, of course, everything in that space is being distorted, and it's pretty easy for voices to make the world that I live in a scary place, simply by saying that that man in the street over there is going to be doing this, or is thinking that, and that it's unsafe. And of course, they lead me towards a dim view, of myself, of the world that I live in. And it's very, very easy for voices to create an experience that is filled with paranoia. And of course, all that's happening is they're doing is provoking, is getting me into a threatened state of mind. And in that state of mind, the belief I'm going to form about what is at the other end of this jack-in-the-box winding the handle is something aggressive with power to influence my life. And then, of course, what they do is exaggerate that power by introducing this other world. So whereas we're warming to the idea of having a connection to ancestors, voices are then asserting ideas about what they are in this otherworldly space that they are then claiming as having dominance over this world by claiming to be God, the devil, aliens, God's messengers of some sort, jinn, angels, demons, the voice of knowledge, the voice of wisdom, the voice of this, that, or the other. So of course, these are just characters at the other end of the handle of this jack-in-the-box. We're warm to this one. Voices are now being much more assertive, at this end of the scale, about what that is, to exaggerate their power. And then I say, as in my case, and I'm not the only one, voices, of course, then came along and declared that I am the second coming, as you saw earlier on the slide. And of course, what that does now is, of course, they've changed my identity, if you like, for me, whether I like it or not. But of course, what they're doing is they're now declaring, my ideas to be theirs. They can disagree with me, agree with me. They can tell me what to do, or so they claim, tell me what not to do. I've now become a pawn by declaring me to be the second coming. I've now become a pawn in their game. And of course, they use that to exaggerate the consequences of every thought. And of course, this is pretty dramatic. And of course, this is how to drive you crazy, quite literally. And it definitely will make you kind of psychotic. But it's all based on this idea now that your thoughts, everything about yourself is shared in this otherworldly space via this hub. And of course, voices have now put me in the middle as the second coming of resolving this kind of problem of this battle between good and evil that's playing out in this other world and in this world. And of course, in the other world, it's this fellow God, the devil, that is in the middle of this hub, slicing and dicing information and sending it wherever they want to and editing it whatever way they want to. And of course, a variation on that is that there are plenty of people who feel, where voices have claimed to be someone in the CIA or some other, or Mossad or some other secret service agency, that is sort of, acting on behalf of powerful figures on the planet. And of course, you're as someone who, just literally as a thinking person, you're a threat to this, whatever entity they decide they want to be. And of course, they're just playing off this relationship between yourself and themselves by exaggerating their power and making you the problem and sometimes the solution. Of course, to encourage and discourage, and by encouraging and discouraging, they're exaggerating your emotions. And then by changing a little nuance like this, suddenly, your pleasant emotions suddenly flick to the paranoid emotions associated with the same theme that they're bugging you with at a particular time. So of course, all that's happening over here is we're finding answers to the same questions. So what, I'm now, I'm asking, I'm reaching an answer that's saying someone or something can see and hear me in my question of how voices have this remote vantage point from which they're observing and knowing. So of course, the answers I reach are something like telepathy or voice to skull technology, or remote viewing, or that these things are multiples, participating in my life, in my mind. These are all just kind of hows, which are often confused with a what who, at the end of this thing winding the handle. And of course, I then start to ask the question, why? And because the behavior is bad and torturing and cruel, they are obviously against me. And of course, I might come up with a because, and of course, the because could be anything based on, the answers I've reached up here. So it could be the CIA that's put me in the middle of this conspiracy theory. It could be a demon. We come up with all sorts of answers. And then, of course, we start to anticipate the where and when. And of course, that, of course, is a sign of voices' intention to sort of undermine, of course, what we're doing. But of course, this where-when thing and this observing and knowing is the stuff that we're interpreting as foreknowledge. So we're interpreting this as voices actually knowing what's about to happen. They don't. They are relying on our confirmation bias to give us signals that confuse us into believing they have foreknowledge of what's about to happen. And it's based, as I say, on our experience of this thing as knowing what I know, because it's interacting with my thinking, and we then start to say, well, okay, if they know what I know, do they know what someone else knows? So when they claim that so-and-so is thinking this, or going to do this, so when this person in the street that I encounter is going to attack me, if that's what voices are actually saying, it's based on the idea that they know my thoughts, therefore they might know the thoughts of this person in the street. And I'm therefore on the lookout, and all I have to do is see that person move in an unusual way. And I feel in a way that I think is unusual, that I then perceive as threatening. And that's just my cognitive bias working against me, because voices have made me fearful, and I interpret in cautious mode because I feel threatened down here. I interpret that in cautious mode as threatening. And of course, I start to respond to it that way, or avoid it, whatever that is. And of course, what happens here now is I have this relation, this phenomenon has imposed an abusive relationship on me, over here. And of course, so it may take that a step further and declare me to be the second coming, or a participant in some conspiracy theory with the CIA, where I'm actually chosen to do something or play a particular role in that experience. So clearly over here, this is much, much more distressing. And of course, voices can make it much, much more distressing. And this experience is psychotic, whereas over here it's psychic. And of course, it's just variations on a theme where this whole kind of concept of observing very soon becomes translated, is translated as knowing. And of course, knowing is easily then predicted, projected into intervening, in life. So very much over here, where voices have, changed my identity for me, if you like, just declared me to be the second coming. I didn't choose that. Voices decided, that I am going to be the second coming, whether I like it or not. So even as I rejected them, they just said, well, we don't care what you think, you are the second coming. And of course, the fact that I objected to evil as having any relevance, of course, was just a stick that they could actually wave at me. And of course, that was their mode to kind of say, well, actually, we're intervening, of course, not just in your life, but in terms of who you are. And so, of course, but the trouble is, say, on this side, we're experiencing this as okay, whereas actually for me, it's completely, it's definitely not okay. It's entirely unethical. It's not transparent. We, on a purely ethical basis, I dismiss that, as being useful to us at all. And of course, unfortunately, what's happening is voices are abusing our, optimistic desire to believe in a life hereafter. And of course, we are unfortunately gullibly actually asking this phenomenon to intervene or to intercede. So culturally, I'm in South Africa at the moment. You can look at an ad in any one of the newspapers and you will see adverts for traditional healers, so-called, or shamans or witch doctors or whatever label you give them. Of course, what they're doing is they're offering things like magic wallets. They're offering to help you win your court case. They're offering to help you when you win a lost lover back. They're offering to help bring you fortune through a magic wallet. And of course, all you have to do is take this herb or whatever, or pay me lots of money, or in some very, very severe cases, bring me the head of a white child or Indian child or whatever, and quite literally you get this kind of stuff happening. So this stuff can be terribly, terribly abused. And of course, religion, the real religions are just a variation on that theme, where voices have sort of, created these experiences, claim to be God. And of course, when we've acted on that, so, go and kill every man, woman, and child, in that village to claim your promised land, for example, to me is the origin, of what we still struggle with as Middle East conflict, with three conflicting religions, having origin in a very small kind of area, sort of on the crossroad of trade routes and things, just to be designed to perpetuate conflict between us, particularly when we act on it. And I say, and we are gullibly actually asking it to intercede. So, this fellow, who is neither God nor devil, is just some strange phenomenon, has created a scenario or a setup, in which the general population is, working with cutesy beliefs in a life hereafter, accepting the idea of psychic powers, whereas actually the translation of all of that into real life is actually not good for us. And certainly for people who experience this thing over here, these things exacerbate the experience and make it far worse and, of course, far more intense. So just to summarize then, I'm focusing here on the kind of what the bleep psychotic side is actually that these two forms of phenomenology that most of us who are experiencing this as distressing are experiencing, is this idea of sort of hearing voices, when what I'm doing is I'm attaching characters to the other end of it. either in this other world or in this world, either way, based on the behavior of voices, the beliefs that I'm reaching about what this thing is, are things that have power because it's unusual. It's imposing stuff on me. It definitely has an effect on my life, an effect in my life, which is an emotionally unpleasant and distressing experience. And based on that, I'm liable to, formulate beliefs about what this thing and what it's capable of, that are certainly not good for me or even for us. And of course, just by shifting the phenomenology and kind of literally lifting my thoughts up into this space, where thoughts and voice, I hear my own thoughts and voices in the same space, that hearing my thoughts brings my attention to my thoughts, and my thoughts now have consequences that voices then, of course, claim are magnificent and or terrible. And of course, that's what's creating the mania and paranoia. And of course, the power of this thing appears to grow from this idea that it's observing. Of course, it can see what I'm doing wherever I am. That piece, I think, is pretty straightforward. Of course, that then is escalated to being all-seeing, all-knowing, and all omnipotent. But of course, all of this over here, is all nonsense. It's based on the simple experience that this thing is observing and commenting on. And of course, this aggressive, invasive experience of bringing your thoughts into focus, in this case. So of course, what voices are doing is, from this vantage point, they're creating an advantage point in which they assert power over us in this relationship between self and whatever belief we form about what it is. So either by suggestion, by interpretation, by creating a vision of something that appears to be Mary, for example, pure suggestion, or by over here by interpretation. So I heard two people talking about what I was doing at home. I logically interpreted that as my neighbors, and then for a couple of weeks at least, I thought my neighbors were not very nice characters at all. But of course, this could be somebody who has abused me in the past or whatever, and is mobile. And of course, if it's mobile, then that has implications in my life. And of course, what this one has done is, by asserting to be God, the devil, aliens, multiples, all of these things, it's exaggerated the power, or tried to exaggerate the power by claiming omnipotence. And of course, has created confusion just by shifting these little frames of reference with small nuance in the phenomenology. And really, all that's happening is, in this mode, voices are provoking with interference. It's like poking at you with a stick or a spear, because they find your soft spots. So if you've been abused in the past, those are things you will reasonably, quite reasonably be sensitive to emotionally. And if voices can jab those things, your reaction will be much stronger. And of course, you're much, much more likely to believe that this voice is in fact your past abuser. Whereas over here, the provocation actually is of intervention. So this is voices claiming to be able to interfere, of course, and intervene actually in everything that you do. And of course, my voice is declared as total war greedy boy. If that were true, I wouldn't be here. But of course, we've been exposed to this thing for thousands of years. And of course, the problems have arisen when we have acted on what voices say and claim to be. So what we've got to do is reject all of that.